Welcome to ZKast, everyone. I'm ZS Caravallo from ZK Research, and I'm going to be talking about fixing the cloud spending problem today. A lot has changed in corporate IT over the last few years. The most notable shift, though, is the move to cost optimization as the top priority for CIOs. It now outranks things like customer and employee experience and is second only to security. And this is a marked difference from just a few years ago. The uncertain macro has only put more focus on reducing IT expenses, and leaders now have to get a better handle on the large buckets of spend, one of which is cloud. To better understand how companies can get a better handle on how to optimize the dollars being spent, I've invited Chris Ortbals, Chief Product Officer at Tangoe, to talk about this. This discussion is aimed at helping IT and financial leaders fix their cloud spending problems. And so welcome, Chris. First, just a quick intro on yourself and tell me a little bit about Tangoe.
Thank you. Thanks, ZK. So real quick, if you're not familiar with Tangoe, or what we kind of call the ITEM industry, we're in the IT expense management industry. As you mentioned, I lead our product and technology groups, but Tangoe's been a 20-year pioneer in this industry, one of the original founding companies in the space. And like we're going to talk about, we have a number of solutions that cover cloud, but also our roots historically have been in the telecom and the mobile space, handling similar things around cost optimization. And so we're an industry leader. We do a lot of things with AI-powered automation. We have about 70 patents that we support our products with, and we have about the largest ecosystem of global partners out there. And just to give you an idea of scale on Tangoe, we have over 15 billion in tech spend under management. And one of the things we're going to talk about today, especially on the cloud area, is we're proud to be a premier partner with the FinOps Foundation, which is a great group that we're working with around our cloud solutions in the industry overall.
Well, Chris, if you can handle the complexities of telecom expense management, I'm sure you can do other parts of spending as well. As a former IT pro, I know that sifting through those old telecom bills is certainly not a trivial task. So what we're talking about is cloud spending and optimization, and cloud unpredictability is really the reason why cost optimization has become the queen of IT priorities. Gartner says that cloud will account for over 50% of IT budgets by next year. That's a massive amount of budget tied up in cloud, but it does make sense. Many companies during the pandemic, they rushed to the cloud, where keeping the IT lights on was really all that mattered. And so companies, in a way, had no choice. Now the cloud bills come due and organizations are experiencing cloud sticker shock. One root problem is with IaaS, and that's that these on-demand resources can spin invoices out of control. The utility-based pricing certainly feels comfortable, but can be rather unpredictable. And IT leaders are tasked with having to focus on things like service usage, rationalization of assets. They have to establish policy for purchasing on-demand resources and other aspects. So, Chris, you've been in this market now for quite some time. And what have you learned from your clients along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And some of the things you mentioned, I too am shocked at how much of the IT budgets are now in cloud. And I think one of the things we see a huge trend on is this growing area of FinOps, right? The companies are seeing a need to standardize around how they manage the control, the spend, the correlation or linkage between the finance organizations and the technology organizations. And so there's a huge trend on that. We obviously are strong believers and adopters of that, but also the companies we work with, they're certifying their teams on it. They've built up their FinOps teams to support this, to get things under control and manage through a standard. But additionally, what we're seeing is obviously the big cloud service providers, the AWSs, the Azures, they're building new cost optimization features. But I think the thing you have to realize is the thing that the cloud providers are great at is insights, right? They've always been good at data, tons of data, but their strength is not in things like expense management. This is where the roots of a company like Tangoe, we've been doing this for decades, right? So everything around expense management, automating all the invoice processing, all those cost allocations, those integrations you need in FinOps around between the IT organizations, the finance organizations. That's where, the cloud expense management industry is a great benefit around that in terms of supporting multiple clouds and having standardization around all of that and the experience in that regard. Now, the other area I would say is what we hear from customers, as that expense amount is rising in the organizations, they need to do something around it. And a lot have taken a DIY approach, right? And if you look at the research out there from the Forresters, the Gartners, they warn a bit around DIY because there's so much data, there's limited automation around that. And what we hear from customers is, we just can't handle it, right? We can't get to the insights. We can't use any automation to get to that. And when you think about maturing an organization on FinOps, it's actually costing them more to go this approach than trying to go with a managed provider or a managed solution overall on that. And just to put that in perspective, a provider in our space and specifically Tangoe, when we work with customers, we see in the first month of getting the tools in place, the processes in place, and an average of 20 to 40% savings recognized just in that first month. So a lot of immediate benefit and improvement over doing it in a DIY approach.
Thanks. Actually, I do think the hyperscalers do an okay job of optimization of cloud spend within their environments. Not a great job, but certainly an okay job. And again, it's really within their own environments. And so, of course, today we live in a hybrid multi-cloud world, and this has become the dominant deployment model. In fact, there's a lot of data points that point to the fact that companies today use 2, 3, 4 different cloud providers. And another thing is that repatriation has become a growing trend. There's certainly a lot of macro issues that are forcing companies to have better control over their data, and that's created this big wave of moving workloads back to from public clouds to private clouds. And but ultimately, this public-private cloud debate is going to continue to swing back and forth like a pendulum, like other things in IT tend to do. And so, as I mentioned, the hyperscalers, they do have a good handle on optimization within their environment, but they're certainly not going to help organizations optimize costs on a private cloud or with other public cloud providers. And so that's that's certainly a challenge and requires a different way of doing it. The other factor is that edge is coming, and that adds another level of complexity. So, Chris, what does that mean for IT leaders who are thinking about their network costs? How does this public-private edge conundrum factor into things?
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit it. There is no right place for the applications, just like obvious, right? They have to look at all the aspects, cost, performance, all of those things. And so, and as you said, hybrid is here, right? Most customers are in multiple clouds. They're in a private cloud. To your point, the CSPs do a decent job on that within their environment, but most customers are in multiple environments and certainly within private. And so one of the things we saw was a need from customers to evaluate the cloud landscape from an IaaS perspective, including private, right? They need an evaluation of where those workloads go, and it's really an apples and oranges type comparison because the public cloud providers do a really good job with the definition of the cost per unit and everything like that. It's a lot of data to go through, but it's fairly consistent. Whereas you get into a private cloud environment and all of the cost visibility is totally different, right? You talked on it a little bit. You've got data center costs, you've got application licensing costs, you've got physical hardware costs, you've got virtual server costs. All of that those are different elements. And so if you're trying to line up all of the costs you have, from network costs in the data center to the private cloud costs, and then lining it up against a public cloud solution, saying, where should I put the workload? It's difficult in that regard because it's not an apples to apples type comparison. And that's why with Tangoe, we set out to build a private and a public cloud solution so you can line up and harmonize or unify those cost measures so you can make an informed decision of this is better to be in public, this is better to be in private. So that's an area where we see a lot of need just because, as you said, hybrid isn't going away. That is the de facto these days. And so you need to look at the whole landscape, not just public.
All right, Chris, I'm going to shift topics a little bit. I know one of the things CIOs that's keeping them up at night now is this big rise in generative AI. Obviously, every company's using it. In fact, it's hard to find organizations not using it at all. Gen AI is now being embedded into different workflows and a lot of applications. And in fact, a lot of companies I've talked to are building their own. But when you think of the compute power to spin up Gen AI and even be able to use it, I think that's a big wild card out there today. And so I'm not sure CA would even know what to expect today from a cost perspective, because it's not like we have good models on these things before.
Right. And that's where I think having the ability to evaluate, is that better because it's going to be a static workload versus a very fluctuating workload that you need to have the ability to say these are going to be better in public versus private, or there could be control or privacy concerns, or you want to take it in-house, those kind of things as well. And so I think that's going to, I mean, all the stats say that that is going to rise in terms of consumption. And so you've got to get in front of that. So.
Yeah, those are good points. Companies have to get a handle on their spending now, and but let's pivot a little bit and talk about SaaS. That's the other big issue in addition to IS. And I'll put my old CIO hat back on for my pre-analyst days. I used to work at a company where we would just purchase whatever the maximum licenses were for everybody, and there's a reason for that. Part of the problem is that we had some employees that needed 3 features, and other employees that needed 5 features, and other employees that needed 8, and so. If we just bought everybody every feature, we knew we'd never be out of compliance, and that was really the goal. So I think while that kind of worked, what we did was we maxed out on licenses, and in fact, I think that's how a lot of people treated SaaS applications during the pandemic. You just overbought what you needed, and then you made sure you knew what you had. But now, though, it's time to reel that in. Overspending has been triggered by accelerated innovation, but we've let costs run amok. So what can you teach us? What kind of advice can you give us here and get a better handle on SaaS spending?
Absolutely. And I think the word I always use with the SaaS landscape is fragmented, right? Like you said, you have a lot of these big licenses, let's say Salesforce, let's say 365, Google Workspace, where, huge amount of spend in the organizations. And with a SaaS-based cloud expense management solution, it's easy to quickly identify all of that spend, get even down to the subcategories, all the different licensing categories. This is an area where we see customers, it's an easy first step into the space because the fragmentation of the organization and the sprawl of the applications is significant. And like you said, a lot of companies bought the highest tier just to cover everything, but now those expenses continue to rise. And you have such an ease with SaaS to consume applications without sanction through IT. So you need something that can have oversight on, okay, we're a team shop, but we have 300 users using Slack in the company. Well, we're obviously spending on 2 different collaboration suite tools. You talked about, the rise of work from home, all of the UCaaS use, all the unified communication, the Teams, the Zooms, everything like that. Those are licenses that are consuming at high rates within the organization. And so having some sort of a cloud expense management tooling for that is an easy first step to get in and say, okay, we can identify all of these. We can say we can optimize these. We can reduce licensing. We can change licensing types. And that's, I'd say, the easier first step. The big piece around it is the automation you need to put around it on a go-forward basis. And the example I always like to use is onboarding and offboarding. A large enterprise has got tens to hundreds of people coming and going every month in the company, and how you manage those application allocations and removals and changes and permissions so that you don't explode your costs overall. And that's where, an expense management platform, something like what Tangoe has, we have over 1,000 automation processes we can put towards that to help support and standardize on a go-forward basis. So again, it's easy to do the front side. Let's find everything. Let's see what our waste is, but it's really the ongoing management of it because the SaaS applications are so fragmented in the organization. It's tough to keep track of them. They're not as centralized as, let's say, public cloud consumption.
I'm glad you used the word fragmented because I've used that a lot too. And I'm going to pick up on that theme. There's one more element of the hybrid multi-cloud world that's come in, and I mentioned that before, but that's edge, and it further fragments cloud costs. Today, every cloud provider has an edge strategy, every telco has an edge strategy, every infrastructure vendor, in fact, has an edge strategy. So unlike public clouds, which was a nice, simple, centralized model, not the easiest to understand sometimes, but certainly fairly straightforward, edge is a little more unpredictable. And architecturally, the edge itself is hard to define, as it's everything from the data center to the public cloud and everything in between. And I think, again, this theme of getting a better grip on your expenses now before edge comes in is important. And so from my discussions with IT leader, edge is becoming a critical component of many IT initiatives. When you think about IoT, when you think about AI, where you want to keep data close to the customer, even when you think about things like autonomous vehicles in certain industries and things like that, the edge is coming and it's coming fast. And so, Chris, what's your take on edge?
No, I agree. And I think it's where, the IT leaders have to take this holistic approach because the edge brings all the aspects together. It is the cloud, but it's also the connectivity to get there. It's also, where people are consuming it, right? It's their mobile devices. It's the transformation of their network to a software-defined WAN, right? It's all of those things. It's changing with the workforce, right? You have remote workers versus people in offices. So the data consumption, the use of the applications, everything is all over the place. And that's where edge comes into play. And that's where the cost optimization has to be looked at holistically, right? The entire IT environment. It's the telecom, it's the cloud, it's mobility or mobile devices, right? That's where all of that becomes much more critical, and more critical in the sense of bringing all of those things together and looking at them holistically.
All right, Chris. Well, thanks for that advice. And I think it's some excellent thought leadership there on the role of cloud, edge, and expense management. But before I let you go, can you talk specifically about Tangoe and what are some of the unique capabilities that Tangoe brings to the market and helps your customers with this problem?
Absolutely. So I think we start a little bit on the cloud side, but I think we talked earlier about this. Tangoe doesn't look at this as a point solution, right? We talked a little bit about public cloud. We talked about software as a service. We talked about private cloud. Our view on cloud is the entire landscape. So it's IaaS, it's private, it's SaaS, and even I touched on it, it's UCaaS, Unified Communication, is a consumption-based cloud model. So you need to look at all of those, and that's the capabilities we bring to bear at Tangoe, is looking at as an entire solution. And again, as I mentioned, wrapping that together with the connectivity cost, with the mobile cost that all those solutions are being consumed against is critical. I'd say also the areas where we have high degrees of expertise is in that financial integration, right? The ability to bring in your budgets, to do those cost allocations, those chargebacks back to those departments is really critical. And that's where I think the depth we have and the history we have in that area of doing that for decades and our other technologies is more and more prevalent with cloud today. And lastly, I would say is, cloud has a ton of data to sift through, to understand where your expenses are, where you're allocating all of that. You really need something that has basically an AI powered, a lot of automation around it to reduce that manual work, let that FinOps team that's building up be successful and not get overwhelmed with a lot of manual processes.
Thanks. And from what I understand, you'll be at the upcoming FinOpsX event, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we're super excited to be out in San Diego at the FinOpsX event. We're one of the sponsors out there. As we mentioned, we're a premier partner with FinOps. That is the week of June 19th. So we're super excited to be out there and hope to see some folks there.
So if people aren't going to the event, they can check you out there. And if not, and they want to check you out on the web, it's tangoe.com.
Correct.
All right. Anything else you want to add?
No, I appreciate the time. Thanks, ZK.
Okay, Chris. Well, thanks. I appreciate having you on. I think it's interesting that cost savings, although never the most exciting thing to talk about, is certainly something that every CIO has to deal with today. I'd say there's tremendous pressure for today's CIOs to cut costs. I don't think I've, in fact, seen this much pressure in a long time. Also, one word of warning and advice: do it yourself does not work. I've tried that before, and it just doesn't scale. So with that note, on behalf of Chris Ortbals from Tangoe, I'm Zeus Caraval from ZK Research, and I'm saying thanks for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. I'll see you next time on my next episode of ZKast. Thanks, Chris.